Hello, good evening, everybody. A warm welcome here. I'm so happy you are all here at this very special occasion. Special because I can welcome the United States Ambassador, Shivali Razdan Dugal. I'm so happy you are here. Yes. Also special, the United States Consul General, Kate Nanavati. Welcome. Good to have you. And of course, of the Polish consulate, the Polish consul, Dagmara Bobak. Welcome. And I would also like to give a special thanks for the people that made this evening possible. And that is, first of all, the director of the Independent Podium for American Culture in the Netherlands, the John Adams Institute. And, of course, the director of the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, the NIAS, Jan Willem Duivendak. Welkom. Warm welcome. And chair of Polish Culture, NL, Bożena Kobrzynska, with whom I did several events already. And they're all equally interesting, Bożena. And of course, the OBA, House of All Languages, for giving us this special location. And special, as you can see, a cooperation. You know, if you join forces, if you join, how can I say, positive energy, then you always get beautiful things. And but before we get started, as you can see, there are cameras all around you. There will be a photographer, just to tell you once more that film and pictures will be taken, so you're aware of that. And I will also want to ask you if you could put down your phones, put them on still, please. Yeah, check one more time, because in a moment we're going to see a play, and it would be really a pity if it would disturb the play. And now I'm really curious, how many immigrants or children of immigrants are here? I could better ask who not. Okay, well, you're rare this evening. You see? Yeah. Okay. So, and everybody, I am sure everybody, every one of you has his or her own story about immigration. The story about either yourself or your ancestors. And all those stories are special stories. And in the Netherlands, immigration, well, most of our immigration is connected with our colonial history. And later, our active search for migrant workers. My father was born in Fez, Morocco, and my mother in the Netherlands. And as a child, my cultural origin was a given. That was, you know, first when I grew older, and then I worked for KLM and traveled the world, and then I was living on the island of Curaçao, and then I realized, okay, this is the value of getting from different cultures and different backgrounds. Yeah, and migration is not something of this era, it's nothing new. And for example, did you know that migration between the Netherlands and Poland, as Polish culture NL is here and Polish people are present, did you know, well no, let me start by asking you something else. Did you know that Amsterdam was built on poles? You did. I also did. I did know that. But I did not know that those poles came from Poland. Did you know that? No. Bożena told me. And it's such a nice thing to know. And the thing is, if you know more, then you understand more. And of course, we cannot know everything. But at the same time, I always think there's always something that I don't know. There are always things that you just don't know. You cannot know everything. But I think it doesn't matter where you're from, but I think that if you realize that the other is not far, but close, and not strange, and that difference is nice. Why not? Different is something positive. Then the road, I think, to more good stuff is free. And good stuff is what we're going to have this evening. So I'm very happy with this. And this evening will consist of 2 parts, actually. We will see a shortened version of a Polish play. And it's by a Polish playwright. It's called The Immigrant. And there will be a short intermission. Of course, we have to take all this away and then be prepared for the second part. And in the second part, we have our special guest, Nancy Foner. She'll talk about her recent written book. And after that, we go more into the things of immigration. And I'll do that together with Nancy Foner and also Els de Grauw. And of course, after, you can all ask your questions. We'll be happy to get your questions and to get in conversation with you. So I'm very much looking forward. And now, I would like to give the floor for the official welcome of the evening. And I would like to welcome first the US ambassador and after the Polish consul. Can I have a warm applause for Shefali Razdan Dugal?
Good evening, everyone. It is truly a pleasure for me to be here with you all tonight. My name is Shefali Razdan Dugal, the United States Ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I would first like to express my sincere gratitude to the John Adams Institute, Polish Culture Netherlands, the Public Library of Amsterdam, and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies for organizing and hosting this event on such an important topic. When I received the invitation to speak, I immediately said yes, because the topic of immigration is very close to my heart. I am the first person of color to serve as a United States ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. With my mother holding the Bhagavad Gita, I was sworn in as the United States ambassador by Vice President Kamala Devi Harris, the first woman, the first Black American, and the first South Asian American to serve as Vice President of the United States. I often tell people, I love the United States like only an immigrant can. I came to the United States when I was 2 years old, and I was raised by a single mom. Mummy worked 2 minimum wage jobs to support us. She was a seamstress during the day, and she cut vegetables at the local grocery store in the evenings. I grew up in the United States since 1973, although I became an American citizen in 1992 when I was 19 years old. I went through the entire naturalization process, and believe me, it is an arduous process. Specifically so I could vote in the 1992 presidential election. Voting for a candidate whom I deeply admired and believed in was my motivation to become a United States citizen. While I faced many struggles, I am profoundly and infinitely appreciative that I grew up in the United States, a democracy, a salad bowl that encourages the many colors, shapes, sizes, and textures which accentuate the diversity and beauty of our country. A melting pot is inherently an incorrect concept, where one's identity must be evaporated away to become something more palpable to others, something less colorful, rich, and dynamic. The United States, like every democracy, has challenges, although it is precisely our willingness to be honest about and work on those imperfections that makes democratic countries so incredibly special. There is a genuine and continuous effort to improve and learn from past mistakes, and that is something I am deeply grateful for within my life. I am confident that democracy is the best solution to make our societies more inclusive and equitable. As a woman of color, I have experienced a fair amount of discrimination within my life. Due to various, often unkind and unfair reasons, I did not frequently feel heard or seen. As U.S. Ambassador, there is an inner fire within my heart to not, whenever possible, have anyone feel the way I did as a kid. That is the reason why it is my priority to engage directly with underserved communities, go to places and visit people who may not have ever anticipated getting to meet a United States ambassador. Democracy is a worthy endeavor, and I am extremely appreciative the Biden-Harris administration is focusing upon that ideal. And we are doing it with irrefutable partners and allies throughout the globe. The illegal and unprovoked war in Ukraine has shown that transatlantic resolve and unity to protect democracy when faced with an aggressive and undemocratic neighbor is more vital than ever in modern history. Ukrainians are fighting for the survival of their homeland and also protecting the God-given values of freedom and democracy, and we will continue to support them. The United States would like to express heartfelt thanks to our friends from Poland. Since February 24th, 2022, more than 10 million Ukrainians have crossed the border into Poland, and approximately 1.2 million of them remain there today. Immigration knows many faces, with refugees being the most vulnerable. Additionally, Poland has provided $3.8 billion in military and humanitarian aid, and remains to be a European hub for much military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. When President Joe Biden was in Poland just a few months ago, he shared the United States' profound gratitude for the extraordinary support the people and government of Poland have shared with Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's unprovoked war of choice. The Ukrainians have undeservedly experienced so very much, and having a neighbor as supportive and generous as Poland is priceless. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and watching the play. We are so lucky to have the artists come from Warsaw to perform for us tonight, and what a great way to set the stage for the academic discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Ambassador, Madam Honorary Consul, dear distinguished guests. On behalf of the Embassy of Poland, on behalf of the Embassy of Poland in The Hague, I would like to thank you for the invitation for this special evening. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. Just a short reflection on this important topic, migration. It's a truism to say that the history of the world is a continuous migration, and the current geopolitical situation only intensifies this phenomenon. From the perspective of my home country, I can say that through ages, Poland has been experiencing migration in both directions. We have been attracting, and at the same time, we have been generating migration. Even if Poland is a fairly ethnically homogeneous country, migration influences Polish identity. The performance which we will watch this evening is based on Sławomir Mroczek, a play titled The Immigrants. It's worth mentioning that the play was written in 1974, 11 years after Mroczek himself emigrated from Poland due to political reasons, first to Italy, then subsequently to France, and later on to the US. The Emigrants shows a bitter and ironic portrait of two Polish emigrants in Paris in the 70s of the 20th century. However, it encourages also a completely different and universal reading. The play is still relevant today, even here in the Netherlands. I had already had a chance to watch this play last year during the premiere show of The Emigrants in The Hague. Therefore, I know that today we can expect many artistic impressions and a strong reflection on the fate of a migrant. I personally look forward to it, and I wish all of you a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, yes. Welcome back, everybody. And it's always nice to see everybody chatting with each other, getting to know each other sometimes, new contacts, and maybe some that you haven't seen in a long time. Nice. Welcome back. And I can imagine the play we just saw calls for a lot of emotions, maybe recognizable, maybe just emotions that you can understand, comprehend. And I think it was a really intense but good play. And I think it was really nice to listen to a different language and at the same time be able to follow it at the screens. I mean, of course, you have to divide your attention, right? But it was kind of nice to be somehow involved in that as a viewer. Yes, and now we come to the second part of the evening. And we will talk more about immigration. And the next speaker, she'll talk about immigration and the transformation of society, of America. And she's a distinguished professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her recent work focuses on comparing immigration in the US today and in the past, and how immigration has been remaking American society. The impact of immigrants over the past half-century has become so much a part of everyday life in the United States that we sometimes fail to see what really happened. And that's what she makes visible through her book, 1/4 of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America. Can I have a warm applause for Nancy Foner?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a few thanks to, I'm delighted to be here in Amsterdam and of course at the John Adams Institute event. And just before I begin, I want to thank Tracy Metz of the John Adams Institute and Jan Willem Dijvendak of the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study for arranging this event. And I'm delighted to be here. To talk about my book, my latest book. I have to show you the cover, right? And my book and my talk this evening, as you've really already heard, are about the very far-reaching and profound changes that immigration has brought to the US in the last 50 years, as it's transformed large portions of the country's institutions and culture. The numbers are really extraordinary, and I say this, you know, I deal with this all the time. I write about this, and I look at it, and I say it, and every time I do, I am struck once again by how extraordinary the numbers really are. By 2020, an unprecedented 45 million immigrants were living in the US. That's the largest number ever, not the largest proportion ever, but the largest number ever. And if you add their children together with their children, they totaled nearly 86 million people, accounting for 26% of the nation's population, more than 1/4 of the country, which is the reason for the title. Up to now, much of the discussion, however, about contemporary immigration impact has focused on how it changes the lives of immigrants themselves. And obviously that's a critically important topic, and much of my own work, in fact, in the past has dealt with that. But in my book, in my latest book, I take a different approach, focusing on how immigration has transformed American society and culture. And I give a big picture view through a national perspective, and I examine a number of key economic, social, political, and cultural domains. So what I'm going to do is just take you very briefly through some of the topics that I discuss and to provide a very brief overview of these changes. So I'm going to start out with the subject of race. Few things have changed America's racial picture more conspicuously than the last 50 years of immigration. For much of the 20th century, race was mainly a matter of black and white in the US. If we go back to 1960, fully 85% of Americans were white, what we would now call actually non-Hispanic white. When most Americans thought of minorities in 1960, they had black people in mind. Hispanics were a mere 3.5% of the US residents, and Asians were barely visible at less than 1%. Non-whites, non-Hispanic whites alone have shrunk to 60% of the population. So it's from 85% in 1960 to today around 60%. Hispanics at 19% have become the largest minority group in the US, and Asians are now at 6%. While about the same percent are black, almost 1/10 are immigrants, with the overwhelming majority from Africa and the Caribbean. And actually, if you can also count the children of black immigrants, about 1/5, 1 out of 5, of black Americans, well, black people in America, right, are immigrants or children of immigrants. The huge growth of the Hispanic population has had an impact on American cities, towns, and suburbs, and the growth is really remarkable due to immigration, but I should also say also to births. The Hispanic population in central cities went from around 3% in 1970 to 25% in 2010. And I know I'm going to be giving a fair number of figures, but I think we really need to see those figures to get a sense of what's been happening in the US. And just to give you an example of 2 cities, the city of Los Angeles went from about 10% Hispanic in 1960 to nearly half by 2019. Miami-Dade County is now a Latino global metropolitan giant. In 1960, 5% of Miami-Dade County was Hispanic. The figure now is 69%. The expansion of the Asian American population in cities like New York and Los Angeles we've seen an expansion there with cities like Los Angeles and New York, which had old historic Chinatowns, although they were actually quite small in population. And we've seen a huge explosion or expansion of the Asian population in places like New York and LA, but they were also an expansion in places where they were hardly present half a century ago. Cities like Houston, for example, Las Vegas, and Minneapolis, and that's just to name a few. And immigration has not just had an effect on demography and the numbers, but also perceptions of race as well. Asians, and probably East Asians, once considered the yellow peril in a common popular view, have now become the model minority, even though, as spiking hate crimes during the pandemic remind us, they are still subject to racial prejudice and discrimination. The very category Hispanic is a modern-day invention, in fact, only first used in the census in 1980. It's now an established category of identity among non-Hispanics as well as many with origins in Latin America, along with the terms Latino and, among some, Latinx. Systemic racism against Black people is all too persistent, as I'm sure everybody in the audience knows. But immigrants are remaking Black America. Now, as I said, about 10% of Black America. There is a greater awareness among many Black and non-Black Americans of ethnic or national origin differences within the Black population, especially in cities where Black immigrants have become a significant presence. And the two that stand out in that way are New York and Miami. But also places like Minneapolis, which has had a very large East African and Somali population, and Lewiston, Maine, same large East African population, where Africans are very visible drivers of increases in the overall Black population. Although whites of European origin are still associated with privilege and often take their white identity for granted, many whites have become increasingly aware of themselves as one racial group in an increasingly diverse America. Around a fifth of white Americans, according to some evidence and some studies, have not just become more conscious of their whiteness, but also feel that whites' dominant position is under threat, in part owing to the decline in the proportion of whites, as well as economic, political, and occupational gains of non-white groups. In the world of politics, immigration has been pivotal in changing electoral coalitions. I can only really do this very briefly, but let me say that on one side, immigration has led to a large growth in the share of non-white registered voters in the national electorate, from 15 to 30% between 1996 and 2019, and they have largely trended Democratic. On the other side, by Democratic, I mean to the Democratic Party. On the other side, many whites, especially non-college educated whites, have been drawn to the Republican Party and its anti-immigrant and anti-minority appeals, motivated in part by anxieties, fears, and resentment that millions of overwhelmingly non-white newcomers will undermine the basic identity of the nation and marginalize and disadvantage whites. Now, let me just say, just as a little footnote here, obviously, immigration is not the only factor in this changing electoral coalitions in the US, but it is a very important factor. And immigrant has emerged as a major focus of political debates and campaigns. Overt anti-immigrant rhetoric became a staple in the strategies of many Republican leaders, most notably Donald Trump, who gave it a legitimacy in political discourse at the highest levels during his presidency. Not just the kind of dog whistles that we heard among previous Republican presidential candidates and presidents, but very direct anti-immigrant rhetoric. Few in the US can forget Trump referring to shithole countries, to calling Mexicans murderers and rapists, or the Chinese virus. And since Trump has left office, anti-immigrant politics remains alive and well in the Republican Party. On the whole, however, immigration has led to many positive changes in the US. Immigrants have provided a lifeline in many cities that were losing population. New York, by the way, the city where I live, one of them. played a key role in the growth of places like Las Vegas and Orlando, Florida, that were becoming major metropolitan areas for the first time, and they've revitalized many far-flung rural communities. They've not, some cases they've led to growth in population, but more often they've sort of staunched the loss of population. In many central cities, immigration helped deteriorating neighborhoods make a comeback by lifting population and spurring economic growth, and immigration was a factor behind the decline in violent crime in urban America from the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. Immigration has also been a force for change and innovation in the U.S. economy, fueling its growth and helping to shape the development of businesses and whole industries. Immigration has had an outsized role in high tech, starting and running major new companies and spearheading innovations in them. In 2018, again, just to give you a sense in terms of some figures, over half of the 91 U.S. startup companies valued at $1 billion or more had at least one immigrant founder, and more than 80% employed immigrants in key management or product development roles. And the groups that are most heavily represented are South Asians, Asian, Indian immigrants, and Chinese immigrants, although others are involved too. Just to give you a few names, of course, we all know Elon Musk, right, a South African immigrant, but Sergey Brin, Russian-born co-founder of Google, Pierre Omidyar, Iranian-born founder of eBay, and Jerry Yang, Taiwanese-born co-founder of Yahoo, and there are many, many more. Nationwide, 1 in 5 business owners in 2014 were immigrants, and they founded about a quarter of new firms. They've reduced shortages in medical and healthcare professions. I think many Americans are very surprised when they hear the figure that 28% of physicians and surgeons in the United States are immigrants. 16% of registered nurses in the US are immigrants, and immigrants have filled jobs and driven up demand in a number of lower-level occupations, such as childcare and elder care, because the millions of immigrants themselves use services and consume goods. They've boosted the economy and job growth, including in an array of public sector jobs. I always like to say, well, we can talk about that perhaps more later. Lastly, immigrants are invigorating and indeed remaking what is thought of as our uniquely, I say our because I'm an American, as our uniquely American culture. The foods Americans eat, the music they listen to, the films they watch, the books they read. If earlier Jewish and Italian immigrants of a century ago brought the US bagels and pizza, salsa today outsells ketchup, and tacos are standard fare. In 2015, Chinese restaurants in the US outnumbered all the McDonald's, Burger Kings, and Kentucky Fried Chickens combined, and they now include a broad range of regional dishes and flavors, and they are really virtually everywhere, including really very small places all over the United States. In popular music, film, theater, television, and literature, immigrants and the US-born second generation have been introducing new themes or reviving old ones in light of their own cultural backgrounds and experiences, and inventing new styles, sounds, and cultural forms. They're leaving their own stamp on novels and memoirs, just to mention two: The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, who is an Indian-born novelist, and The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, who is a Dominican. Both of them won the Pulitzer Prize for those novels. Immigrant and second-generation pop music superstars have brought Latin rhythms fused with American popular music to mainstream audiences, introduced the sounds of Jamaican reggae, Cuban salsa, and Dominican merengue, and played a major role in the creation and development of hip-hop, which is very often thought of as an African-American invention, and although African-Americans were involved in its origins, so were immigrants from the Caribbean, both from the English-speaking Caribbean and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. In terms of some of the superstars, one of the most famous is Cuban-born and Miami-based Gloria Estefan, a recipient of Kennedy Center Honors for her contributions to American culture. Kennedy Center Honors are a very big deal in the United States, a big TV presentation, very, a great honor. In terms of hip hop and rap, Nicki Minaj, born in Trinidad, is said to be one of the best-selling female rappers of all time. So I'm going to conclude, right, after this very brief review, that immigration of the last 50 years has been reshaping and remaking America. And I should say, this is, of course, nothing new. Immigration has always been reshaping and remaking America. But it is doing it in new ways in the recent period. If there's a final lesson, it's that immigration has been, and no doubt will continue to be, a part of the evolution of American society and culture, and understanding these transformations is and should be a key part of our understanding and analysis of immigration's enormous impact in defining and redefining America. So I'll stop there and we can have more of a conversation about some of these changes. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Please have a seat.
Okay.
Well, that was a quick one, right?
Yes.
And I'm sure you have so much more to tell. And yeah, in the book there's
Yes, I have to hold it up again, right?
that's
very nice cover.
That's what I wanted to say. It's such a nice cover, so colorful.
Yes.
Yeah. That was, you thought about that, I guess.
Well, I won't go into the story of the cover.
Well,
but I want
short
the idea.
version.
No, but the idea was good, and actually the press came up with that.
All right.
So that cover. So I thought it was very good. Princeton University Press.
Very nice. Yeah, and to continue with the conversation, and like you said, you just pointed out a few points of your book. I would like to invite the next person here on the seat. Yes, please have a seat. Associate Professor, International Migration Studies, Baruch College, the City University of New York. You're interested in immigration, civil society organizations, urban politics, government bureaucracies, blah, 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 and public policy with a focus on understanding how governmental and non-governmental organizations build institutional capacity for immigrant integration and representation. Do you follow?
That was a mouthful, I know.
She gives, amongst others, talks to help promote immigrant integration through local action. And she is an in-residence fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. A warm applause for Els de Gauw.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's so good to have you here. Thank you for being here. Yeah. Well, we just really heard a brief part of what's in your book. And like you already said, it is a different book with a different approach. What was initially the reason to write it in this approach for you personally?
Well, I'd done so much work on my own, and so much of the literature, and I'm a sociologist, but in the social sciences, is on how immigrants themselves change and how they become integrated or not into American society. And obviously this was a very, very important topic, and I do work on it myself, but I really thought we needed to have an overview book that looked at how they've been changing the U.S. Because so much, if there are books that look at immigrant, how it changes America, they often just focus on one city or one group. They don't look at a big overview, and so I thought it was time. And I should say also that when reporters call me, and they often say, how is it changing New York? How is it changing the U.S.? I mean, that's a question that people want to know. And so I thought, the U.S. has been having really massive immigration since 1965, and I didn't really discuss that or even mention it. Why 50 years or why 1965 was this big, important year in immigration in the U.S. So maybe I could just frame it a little bit. In the 1965 Act, which is actually sort of part of the Civil Rights Act movement, a result of the Civil Rights movement, eliminated national origins quotas that had been in place since the 1920s. And just to backtrack a little bit, they had been put in place in the 1920s in the US basically to stop or and severely reduce immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, primarily Italians and Eastern European Jews, who were coming in the millions at that time. And so the 1924 Act put in place national origins quotas that gave preference to Northern and Western European countries and slashed the quotas from Eastern and Eastern and Southern Europe, as well as other places as well. I mean, Asian immigration, which had already been cut, in the Chinese case, was cut further in 1924. So this was really the system that existed. In 1965, they did away with national origins quotas, and now the system favored family reunification. Actually, about 2/3 of immigrants who are lawful permanent residents, admitted as lawful permanent residents, come as family members of those who are already here, and the basis of employment. And after 1965, the numbers of immigrants rose and kept rising, so that in the last, since 2001, and every year, the U.S. has admitted at least around 1 million lawful permanent residents every year. Yeah. And also, as I said, employment. And also, the source countries changed. So just to give you an idea, in 1960, 75% of the immigrants in the U.S. were European. Now, partly many of them were older who had come earlier in the century. Today, 11% of immigrants in the U.S. are European. They are overwhelmingly from Asia, Latin America, and Africa is growing too, but the main areas are really Asia and Latin America.
Yeah, no, and what I was thinking while you were telling that, I was thinking like, yeah, so actually if it wasn't for the immigrants, it would have been really boring.
Well, the question, it would have been more than boring. It would have been, I mean, who would do a lot of the jobs? Who would have given the economy the vitality, and the cities and rural, I mean, the vitality?
And actually the cities, because that is good to clear up a little bit, because while Nancy gives us more like an overview, you are more like in the cities, right?
Yeah, I'm one of those researchers that focuses on one city and then sometimes loses the big picture. So anyway, I'm just
so then you go to Nancy, and Nancy gives you the picture, and then you dive in again.
I look at cities in the contemporary political context, and big cities, the big kind of cities like I do research right now in New York City, where I also live. I live in Brooklyn. But also Atlanta and Houston and San Francisco and Detroit.
All right.
And so I'm really interested in how cities that are welcoming or receiving a lot of immigrants or trying to attract a lot of immigrants, how they do that, and what policies they design to help these immigrants integrate and to become part of the community. And so I'm also interested, of course, in differences among cities, because Nancy's book is really wonderful in providing a large overview and also the then versus the now. And sometimes I'm looking at particular policy struggles in cities, and they can be very heated. And then I'm reminded, I think there is an upward line that we are working towards something good. But sometimes in my work, I don't always see that, because I'm looking at one city in a relatively short span of time.
So that's actually because I wanted to ask you that. What does the book mean for you specifically in the way you work? So it gives you like an overview which you can use in the way you do.
Yeah, and of course, if you study cities, given that the U.S. is a federated system, federated government system, the federal government has the most power, near monopoly power, when it comes to immigration issues and citizenship issues. And so there are states and cities and counties below that, but they need to navigate in this. Sometimes I call it a cage of federalism. There's things that they can do in dealing with immigrants, but also gives them, I think, opportunities. And so Nancy's story also helps me to remind what that kind of national kind of policy framework is that cities and states need to maneuver within.
And Nancy just mentioned that immigrants were also good, let's say, to fill up cities to make schools work and all that. But and now you mentioned like the immigrants who come into a city are being invited. Are they being invited? Are they needed still at this moment? Do you see that tendency?
There are cities that are trying to make themselves welcoming to immigrants and sending clear signals that they want them. I've done research in Detroit, which is a fabulous and interesting city to study. And so Detroit used to be an immigrant gateway. Back in 1870, more than 40% of its population was foreign-born. At the peak in 1950, the city had a population of 1.8 million. Today, it is a shadow of what it formerly was, and it has just about 700,000 residents. A lot of people have left to the suburbs. The auto industry, of course, has gone through changes.
Yeah.
The economy transitioned from an industrial to a knowledge-based economy, and Detroit was kind of the epitome of the struggle, the Rust Belt struggle.
Yeah.
And now I think about 5% of the city is foreign-born, but the city would like more immigrants to come, to start small businesses, to create new jobs, to reinvigorate the schools, and it's a challenge.
But at the same time, and that's also something you mentioned in your book and right here as well, people are always talking about, yeah, but if more people coming and more immigrants, there's, you know, all those bad things that happen. And you state in your book, that's not true. But why is that idea so strong?
Well, I mean, I actually wanted to shift back a little instead of answering first that question, because
ahead.
I think I wanted, again, to put it, since Els was talking about, you know, Detroit wanting immigrants, I was going to sort of put it a little bit in the national perspective, because I think America will continue to have large numbers of immigrants coming and being admitted, because there is a great need for immigrants and will be a great need for immigrants in the future. I mean, for one thing, America is aging. By 2030, all of the baby boomers, which was a huge cohort, will be 65 or older. They're retiring. They're leaving the labor force. For another thing, the U.S. has declining fertility. It's below replacement level, so Americans are not having enough children, and plus, who is going to pay for the growing number of elderly who are retiring, the baby boomers are going to be a huge cohort, and who's going to be, the way the Social Security system works is that those who are currently working pay for those who are retired, and who's going to pay for them? So there is a great, I mean, just on that level alone of those demographics, there is going to be a huge need for immigrants. And in fact, we see this, I don't know how, well, I read the New York Times today, a story about the President Biden, some of the executive measures that he's been taking to allow more many hundreds of thousands humanitarian immigrants into the United States. And very interesting, in some areas, the Republican cities are against this and claiming that it's, you know, ruining America, and one of the issues is diversity. But actually, a lot of employers in these areas say, we need immigrants. We don't have enough workers. And so, I mean, there's always been that tension in the U.S.
Yeah.
But, you know, why, and I think to go to your question about why people are, I mean, a lot of it seems to be in the U.S. case is a lot about race and about the changing racial and ethnic diversity of the United States.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big reason, not the only one, a big reason why people are not so excited about, in some places, not all. And I think that's, by the way, different cities are different in terms of their welcoming policies. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, and actually I have written a lot about New York. And New York City is a very relatively welcoming city to immigrants. It happens to be a democratic city. It happens to have a city with a very long history of immigration. It has a very large immigrant population of over 3 million with their children. They're more than 60% of the population. And and every racial ethnic group in the city has a large percentage of immigrants, including there are a lot of white immigrants from Europe. And so I think New York is very is welcoming of immigrants. I always like to tell the story, and then I'll stop. But it was in the New York Times when Rudolph Giuliani, who I'm sure many of you've all heard of, right? Who was trying to run for president, and when he was trying to run for president, he was very anti-immigrant because he was running as a Republican. However, when he was mayor of New York, he was actually very sympathetic to immigrants, and especially undocumented immigrants. And so the columnist in the New York Times, as he said, he's a long way from Ellis Island. Because if you want to get elected to a citywide office in New York City, you have to be pro-immigrant. You have to be, you cannot be an anti and get elected in certain sections of the city for local office, maybe, but not in a citywide office.
You were talking about race, and while reading your book, I realized, and I wonder how you experienced that, because you are from Holland and you moved to the States. When I read the book, and it's so much about race, of course, but also the registration of black or who is to be registered black or white, and then the story of the father in a mixed marriage and the children, and then one is really black and other. I don't recall, I mean, of course, in Holland there's discrimination, and we talk about, you know, where you're from and all that, but there's no registration, I think, in race, in are you black, or, and I'm always wondering, okay, what am I, you know, and I'm also a mix, and like me, there's so much more, but in the States, it's always, you have to decide, how do you look, okay, so then you can be white, and I know families also, they have light-skinned children who could be white, but are, this is something typical American, right, to register race, or how
to identify.
To identify, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure if you're hinting at the census, which is the population, the official population count that the U.S. government does, and so there's a decennial census where everybody will get a form, and on that you have to. You're invited. You're asked to mark off what, you know, how you see yourself, and so it is self-identified.
Yeah. So actually, it's seen as a.
There's a whole other discussion about what society ascribes to you, but this, I think, here you're talking about self-identification, how people, you know, mark themselves on this official government document form, that then is really important for. Well, how government seats are allocated, how government resources are distributed to communities. So it is hugely important. But I'm not sure you wanted to go there. But
well, I was just wondering, you know, like, this is really something different than here. And of course, here we talk about, okay, maybe what's your descent? So you're Dutch, for example, Moroccan, or so that's your descent. But it's not the way you are. And I thought, what impact does that have? And now I understand it gives you also, let's say, like, good things. In the sense of that you're able to receive also benefits of that.
Well, I think part of this in the U.S. is a product of our different history.
It is.
I mean, America has a history of African slavery.
Yeah.
Since the very beginning. It has, after slavery, the emancipation, after we fought a bloody civil war over this. Yeah. There was legal segregation and oppressive white supremacy in the American South. There was ghettoization, and this was of people with African descent. You know, this is a legacy that has shaped not just the lives of people who are labeled black in the United States, but other groups as well. Color-coded race is a very powerful factor in the United States. And I mean, it was interesting you raised the issue of mixed unions.
Yeah, there was all
because actually mixed unions in the U.S., although, I mean, they've been greatly on the rise, and I did mention that in the book as a generator, perhaps, of racial change in the future. Just again, to give you some figures, in 2015, 1 out of 6 new marriages was between people of different race or ethnicities, most of them involving one person who was white. And in 2017, 1 out of 10 children born, infants, had a minority and white parents. So that mixed unions and multiracial children are a growing number in the U.S., but if you look and compare, say, to the Netherlands, certainly in terms of black-white unions, they are much more common and much more widely accepted, I would say. In the US, especially with black-white unions, I mean, after all, we missaid, the Loving versus Virginia, I don't know how many of you saw that movie, which was a very good movie about, the Supreme Court case that made, outlawed, the miscegenation, anti-miscegenation laws became outlawed only in the 1960s in many southern states.
Yeah.
I mean, this is so there have been since then, there have been a growing number of black-white unions. Yeah. But the number still lags. And also what we find in research is that particularly the children of black-white unions find it difficult not to be seen. They're seen as black often, not as multiracial. The question, really the big question for the future is how will the children self-identify, but not just self-identify. The question is how will they be identified by others? Exactly. For example, we know that Asian, that's a large group that includes many different, national origin groups that are very different. But as a big category, about a third of the second generation Asians in the US have a partner of a different race or ethnicity and mostly white. So, the question is how are they. The data so far show that many of them have many white friends, that they find it easier to be identified at times as white. Will they identify, they're not, that's another question. I'm just raising all these questions that we really don't know the answer
But
to.
Actually,
but
Nancy, we invited you for answers.
It shows. No, I think what we have to say is, America has had this terrible history of slavery, segregation, ghettoization. We know, police victimization in the U.S. And yet, we look back to the past and we can see, for example, that Jews and Italians who came at the beginning of the 20th century, they were considered racial inferiors. They were quite despised. They were seen that they would never assimilate to America, that they were ruining America's racial stock. They would never believe if, we told them what was happening today. And in fact, even among the ambassador mentioned Kamala Harris, who is, the vice president, who has a Jamaican father and an Indian mother. We had a black president, who had an African father, And people, I would say 50 years ago, would have said that would be impossible. Yeah. So I think what we have to see is that, ideas about race are changeable. They're not permanent. And, immigration,
actually hopeful.
Immigration is one of the big factors changing that. Not the only one, but one of the big factors changing how people in America think about race, and that will continue into the future.
Well, which is actually hopeful.
Yes.
And I also read that schools and hospitals nowadays they have a different approach also to cultures and language. And I think especially when you look at cities, governments have established this new immigrant affairs offices. What do you see changing there?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm interested in studying is looking at these offices that an increasing number of cities and states, by the way, also have created to try to think about how they can address in a more proactive way questions of immigrant integration. And so New York City has had an immigrant affairs office since the mid-'80s, and so I think really was a front runner, but most other cities that have them today, and there's more than 40 cities nationwide that have such offices, they all kind of happened in the mid to, the first decade of the 21st century. So, and I think it was often because cities and states were frustrated with the federal government not passing comprehensive immigration reform, and cities were saying, well, we still have all these immigrants in our midst, and basically we can't afford not to do anything about it. And so here we're talking about cities that have more democratic and progressive leadership that would set up these offices under the purview of the mayor, and so and and they run the gamut. You know, a city like Houston has an immigrant affairs office with 2 staff, but they have a foreign-born population of about almost 700,000. So, you know, they can only do so much, right? But in New York City, it's, as Nancy mentioned, a city with a population over
8.5 million.
8.5 million, and an immigrant population, foreign-born population of over 3 million, and that office has 50, 60 staff, and they can do a lot more. And they're very present, and say they do a variety of things. They, first of all, work with other city agencies to make sure that they also understand that a lot of their customers, clients are immigrants who have maybe specific needs, maybe particular language needs, as you mentioned, or other kinds of, you know, challenges that maybe are a little different from, you know, your English-speaking New Yorker.
Yeah.
And so that they're better aware of it. They sometimes push for policies at the local level, municipal ID cards, for example.
Yeah,
is a
I
good
wanted
example.
to talk about you with that, because you also wrote a book, an award-winning book, and making immigrant rights real. And one of the things you investigated, if I'm correct, is about this municipal ID card.
Yep.
And I know that in Amsterdam, for example, they're also looking for ways to solve this the problem with undocumented persons, and this could be a way to do it, right?
Yeah, so there's a growing number of cities that have, again, taken matters into their own hands, and they have a lot of undocumented resident in their jurisdictions who might not be able to get a driver's license, which are issued by the states. And so if they're undocumented, they don't have a lot of forms of identification, but if you've been to the United States, you know that very often you need a form of identification to conduct your daily lives, to enter buildings, to pick up your kid from school.
To participate,
to open a bank
life.
account,
Yeah.
you name it. And so New Haven, Connecticut was the first city in 2007 to create a municipal ID card program. So these are ID cards that only have validity inside the city that issues them. They're available to everybody, including folks without legal status or without U.S. citizenship, and they need to be accepted by all city entities. And first and foremost, they serve as a form of identification. So if you go to pick up your kid at school, they let you in.
Yep.
Or if you need to go to a government-run recycling center, or maybe there's
It really is the base to be able to participate,
Yes.
and from there on, try
Yep.
to build your life, right?
Yep.
Another thing is also...
Well, maybe we should just pause a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to leave maybe we shouldn't leave such a rosy view, right? That you just get your I mean, undocumented immigrants in the United States have a very difficult time. And there are a lot of them, I mean, in the country as a whole, right? There are about 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants. They are an increasingly settled population. 2/3 of adult undocumented immigrants have been in the U.S. 10 years or more. There's virtually no way, I mean, it's become increasingly hard to legalize your status. You know, so I think they run the risk of deportation, particularly in certain areas and under certain presidents. I mean,
Yep.
and you know, they live often in mixed status families, so their children are citizens because they were born in the U.S. Yeah. They're often afraid to access services, even if they and their children have access to them. There was actually a study in New York City that showed that even though the children had access to U.S. programs, of health programs for their children, the parents were not applying. They were afraid that they were going to be caught. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is a big problem in the U.S. I mean, Obama tried to deal with this, President Obama, by providing, you know, the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, for young people who came into the country as a very young age who were undocumented, by giving them, if they applied and got DACA, they could not be deported, and they had the ability to work, which is another problem, right, for undocumented. Yeah. In terms of working, because they can't show documentation, they are not able to get jobs in certain mainstream institutions. They are exploited at work. I mean, you could go on and on and on. So that is a problem in the United States.
Well, and also I think it bears reminding that these municipal ID cards, it's just, you know, it's this relatively small number of cities that are doing this. And so I call them the integrative cities, but you also have plenty of cities that are much more kind of going the enforcement route of things. You know, they embrace collaborations with federal immigration officials to find and detain and then deport undocumented immigrants. So it's a very, I mean, undocumented immigrants have a very, very tough time. And depending on where they live, and that's something that I'm interested in, depending on where they live in the United States, they can be treated very differently by city or state governments, depending on the orientation of the people in power, the number of civil society organizations on the ground that can offer them a lending hand, or if there's programs like municipal ID card programs, or in New York City, we have now better access to healthcare, even for folks who are undocumented and don't have health insurance. And so, but again, it is.
I understand.
It's the exception. It's the
but
exception.
I understand, and of
But
course,
I want to actually, can I just come back to something that you asked me before, which was, you know, why are people don't like immigrants, or why do they have this feeling? First of all, a lot of Americans have the misconception that the majority of immigrants are undocumented. I mean, that comes out in surveys. They are not. You know, the majority of immigrants are lawful permanent, you know, are in the U.S. legally. They have some kind of visa that allows them to be in the U.S. They may not be lawful permanent residents, but we have a lot of temporary immigrant visas that people get. So I just wanted to, you know, I think that's another aspect
that's good to mention.
of people's feeling about, about immigration, that they overemphasize the number of undocumented, and also think they're all being smuggled across the border, when in fact about half of the undocumented came on temporary visas of one sort or another and overstayed. Many of them are overstayers. So
it's good to mention those.
I just wanted to,
no,
because that I think is another
important.
reason people feel like, and they often say, many Americans will say, well, my relatives, when they came, you know, they were documented, they were legal. Today, they're undocumented. Well, when immigrants came at the turn of the 20th century, there were no numerical limits on immigration. All you had to do was get on the boat. Well, you know, in Germany or in Italy, now you had to be inspected there for health, because actually there was a law, in 1901 that said if the steamships brought people to the U.S. and they were rejected, they had to pay for the passage back. So they held their own inspections on the boats in Europe, so that most got through Ellis Island very easily. That's another myth, that, you know, everyone got turned away. No, very few, 2% or something did not get through. But, you know, so they had this myth that, you know, because there was really, the only, I mean, that does not apply to Asian immigrants. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 banned basically Asian immigration. So they did not have the ability to just come. But immigrants from Europe, really, they didn't have these limits. Visas, you didn't need a visa until the 1920s.
I want to talk about another thing. It's just compared to these issues a little bit lighter, but it's also an important thing. It's the language. As I could read in your book, the ideas about language also changed, and it's nice to mention it as well, because Polish culture also gives attention to bilingual children. A lot of kids here in Amsterdam are bilingual, or even they know more languages, and recently they have changed in this city the idea of the importance of just learning one language, and also giving importance to the language from ancestors, parents, or even from the kids themselves. And how is that happening in the US at this moment? Is there more awareness? I read that at schools there's more attention also for the other languages, also for the other cultures that might be in a family. So the approach of language with all the new insights that we have also have changed or not. So I'm curious.
Well, I mean, we have bilingual programs, we have dual immersion, and there are a number of programs that have arisen and been sponsored, paid for. I mean, the government has programs, because all this, they're faced with having children in schools who come in without English, and in some cases, you know, there are multiple languages in schools. I mean, it is a problem for the schools. So yes, there have been new language programs in schools. There have been translation programs now in hospitals. You know, there's, yeah, I think, but to, looked at from a different way, right? Because a lot of Americans, I'm getting to some of the myths, right, that people have, is that, again, about immigrants today, is that they don't learn English, right? That they're, and by the way, maybe I should have a footnote here. Unlike in the Netherlands, where people speak many languages, this is not true in the United States on the whole. I mean, you know, it is a very English-oriented culture where people don't learn and speak other languages. The most cosmopolitan this way, I would say, are immigrants, right, who speak other, you know, who are bilingual, right? But what we find...
So they set a new trend again.
Well, they may. I mean, we have, for example, yes. Well, I mean, for example, well, you know, there's Univision and Telemundo, which are these major networks that are in Spanish. But one of the, just to come back to this issue of, you know, that English, you know, they're not learning English. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And that's on an issue. I mean, just as in the past, what we find is that immigrants who come as adults speaking another language learn some English, but, you know, they're not that fluent. Their children are fluent in English, but often speak another language, so they're bilingual. And by the third generation, we find actually the overwhelming majority of the grandchildren of immigrants speak only English. In fact, one of my colleagues in sociology talks about the U.S. as being the graveyard of languages. You know, so yeah, so we, okay. I mean, we have.
Yeah, if I could just add, I do think there is growing appreciation in the United States for folks being multilingual, right? I think it's kind of cast as it is a skill, right? It's a skill that will help you in the labor market, and so immigrants indeed understand that English is the language of opportunity, right? They want to learn it. I think what's often challenging for immigrant adults is that they can't always find the time or the money or a classroom to go to because there's not enough ESL kind of opportunities, English as a second language opportunities for them to learn English. And so just in my work on city governments, I think cities that know that immigrants will keep coming, there's a constant replenishment of immigrants who don't speak English well, like New York City and San Francisco. They have adopted language access programs to kind of force government to provide information and services in a number of the top spoken languages in the city. And there's pushback because people that believe that Americans should speak English will say, you're discouraging immigrants from learning English. And I think I look at it as it's a necessary temporary measure to help immigrants to get access to government information and services so that they get access to the services and programs that they should have access to. And so New York City, I think, is the leader in this regard in that it is now requiring city agencies to translate information and services in 10 non-English languages. So go figure that for a city of 8.7 million, what logistically is involved to get that done. In San Francisco, it's 3 languages, Spanish.
And it's often not getting done. I mean, it's hard. If you
it's hard. It's
English.
logistically a challenge.
Very hard. Let me just, I mean, for my students, I teach at the City University of New York has large, I mean, it's enormous numbers of children of immigrants. And, you know, the number of students who've come to me and say, I can't come in this, you know, tomorrow because I have to go with my grandmother to the hospital, even, you know, because I have to translate for her, and I have to go deal with, you know, Con Edison, that's the electricity, you know, I have to help my parents and my grandparents, so that, I mean, there is an even greater need, and the federal government
at the same time, these students are critical of language access programs like the one that I mean, I've had these conversations with my students. I teach in CUNY as well. We have immigrant students, and they're like, well, immigrants should just learn English. I'm like, yes, but, you know.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Before we continue, I would like to invite you, if you have any questions. I have this really nice writing. Yeah, some questions coming up. I will throw it at you. Yeah, yeah, gaat ie goed?
Oh my God.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
This is always exciting. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, hi. Thanks to the both of you for enlightening us. I actually have 3 questions.
3.
You're getting
Sorry.
Wow.
Given U.S. politics being what it is, do you see a pathway towards federal immigration reform? That's question 1. Second of all, the mayor...
Well, let's stay there for one moment.
Okay,
Let's stay there for one moment.
keeping this.
Because otherwise, you know. So, did you hear that?
Yeah. So what are the prospects for federal immigration reform?
Yes.
That's a big one.
It's a big one.
That's a big
yeah,
one.
I mean, I don't know. I want it to happen, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. I think the lines are drawn so sharply between the leading political parties. The issues that they need to come together on, I think, is really hard, whether it's undocumented, offering a path to citizenship for the undocumented. That's one thing that's on the table. Stepping up enforcement is always on the table. Refugee and asylum seeker issues, the whole border situations. I mean, I can't even give you a quick and concise answer. Yeah, I think no, not in the immediate future.
I don't either. And in fact, it's what's led President Biden to try to do things through executive measures and administrative measures. And by the way, Trump did things through a lot of, they were different administrative measures. But he too, in fact, part of the Biden administration problem was undoing the administrative measures that Trump had put into place. So this is how change has been happening, but obviously, it's very difficult in terms
And actually, I
of
think
Congress.
Yeah,
I think.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think it's actually more interesting to look at states and cities.
Yeah, and I
because
guess that's
there's
part
a
of the
lot
answer,
of
right?
really interesting stuff happening. It's my hope, I don't think it's realistic, but that some of this will kind of percolate up, right? But I don't think that's going to happen. But there is, I think that's where a lot of the interesting policy action is happening these days.
Yeah.
Well, but we have things yes, that's true, but there are some really pressing needs.
Yeah,
even
no,
DACA,
yeah.
Which is going to come before the Supreme. It's discouraging.
I want to see if anybody else has a question, because I'm sorry, then I have to.
We'll come back.
Right,
We'll come back to you.
right behind you. Oh, there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ival. I studied American Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And
I have an American Studies graduate from Nijmegen, though, but anyway.
Oh, well, almost.
Connections.
I'm forgiven.
And I lived in Ohio, and I think Ohio is an interesting thing because not too long ago I went back for my 25-year reunion, and I spoke to one of my classmates, and he said that Ohio, as an aging state, tries to get medical care as their selling point, so people move in. But especially for hospitals and stuff, you need immigrants a lot, because especially when there are many older people in Ohio. Ohio is not so much a democratic state anymore, very Republican. How do states like Ohio get those immigrants in for the industries they need, while the politics, on the other hand, tells them to go away?
Okay. So if they work together, well, actually, that's also something you mentioned.
Well, I don't know how many jobs there are in Ohio. But, Ohio has lost jobs. Especially for unionized workers and white workers. So yes, they're encouraged. It's interesting about immigrants, though. If there are jobs, immigrants tend to now gravitate to places where there are jobs, even when they're in places where the politics are rather hostile. You look around, that's how there have been some changes in states. But they come to the U.S. to work. To work, yeah. That's why they come. They come to work. They come because they want their children to do better. Yeah. And they work hard. They want to send. Often they come because they need and want to send money back home. So they are motivated to work, and they'll often go to places that are not very hospitable, because that's what they're not the only person there. They're going to places where there often are immigrant communities, and immigrant communities grow.
So is
but
that,
I think that they do go to places.
That is not. There's not an answer to his question. Actually, it's just a difficult situation.
But it's not all doom and gloom in Ohio, because Dayton actually has been leading the kind of welcoming movement. So some cities will kind of, even if they're in a sea of red state officials, right, they will kind of do their thing. And Dayton actually, worked very closely with this nonprofit Welcoming America to do what they can locally to make the city attractive to immigrants. Maybe not, they cannot bring immigrants from outside, but they can maybe woo immigrants from elsewhere in the U.S. to come to Dayton. I'm not sure to what extent they were successful, but
And employers are involved as well.
Yeah.
And there are networks of immigrants who also tell people about what the jobs are available, and that's how they find out about jobs. And often employers actually prefer to hire immigrants. And so, the word gets out, heavily through networks. But employers, I think that's also a big fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, one last question. Ooh, now it's getting... Who gets the dice? One last question.
Hello, good evening. My name is Eva. I have a very short question.
Oh.
It's 2023. We are in US, in New York. My visa expired. What do I do to become legal, so to speak?
Very practical question. Yeah.
So you said
She wants to become legal.
Oh, you want to become, you become
Wait, do you want to immigrate as an... You are
already
undocumented
there.
and you're living in New York.
So I'm undocumented, right?
Yep.
So what do I do to be able to stay as a...
Oh my gosh. Well,
Talk to a lawyer.
Okay, talk to a lawyer, I hear here.
Yes, go to a lawyer.
But it's hard. I mean, it's
very
hard.
hard.
Yeah.
It's become very hard, which is one of the reasons for the big increase in undocumented immigrants. I mean, in 1990, there were 3.5 million undocumented immigrants in the US. Now, one argument is that's because it's become much more difficult to go back and forth to Latin America and Mexico because it's more dangerous, it's more expensive. Doug Massey, a sociologist, makes this argument. But it's been made much harder to legalize your status. I mean, some people still seem to be able to do it, although then I shouldn't even, through marriage. And then you have the person, you can have but that's become very difficult to do.
Okay, so marriage.
Yeah.
I want to make an exception. I want to make an exception because I said the last question, but I really cannot ignore Božena. So go ahead, Božena.
Well, I have I have one question as a Polish representative. I don't know if you knew that actually the second biggest city outside of Poland is in US.
For Poland.
That's Chicago.
Oh, the Polish city.
Yeah, the Polish
Sorry,
city.
I was like, yeah.
That's the big one. But going to statistic, actually, in 1990, 150 million people were on move worldwide. In 2020, it's almost doubled, it's to 181. And as a migrant in the Netherlands, I noticed that actually policies, as Fadwa was actually saying, policies towards the migrants are slightly changing. There is more acceptance. And I heard today one word that I get incredibly allergic to, assimilation. That in America, in the beginning of 20th century, that was expected of the newcomers, the new people who are coming, the migrants, to assimilate. My question is, has the awareness of people, American people, and not only policymakers, but the American people, because that's where in the end it starts, has it changed, that it's not about assimilation, but about integration?
You mean integration, or did you say immigration?
It has
integration.
Integration.
Okay.
It has changed.
Instead of assimilation, integration.
And I think
Good question.
I think it has changed in that if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, the idea was you have to be 100% American and nothing else, and you have to give up your ethnic culture to become American, and that was a sort of dominant view. That's not the dominant view anymore. Americans, immigrants and their children can be hyphenated Americans, and that's widely accepted. They're not expected to give up their culture. They can be both, and they can have both at the same time. You can become American and you can maintain your traditional, your former, your culture from the country of origin. So I think, that's I think not everyone accepts that, but it's widely accepted. So I think that is a big change in the United States from 100 years ago and today.
Good news, Božena. Good news.
Policymakers?
It depends on which policymakers, and what their rhetoric is. If you're at the Democratic Party and you watch on television the Democratic Convention, it's all about celebrating diversity and the cultures that immigrants and all Americans, you don't have to be just an immigrant, but that all Americans have, and that's a wonderful feature of the United States. You see politicians speaking Spanish. If you go to the Republican convention, it's different. So I think that, there are also political differences in terms of if you're looking about how the leaders operate.
And I want to give the last word to Else.
Yeah, just quickly commenting or adding to what Nancy already mentions. In my research, I do a lot of interviews, including with state and city officials, and this is exactly what we're talking about. And they use the language of integration, multiculturalism, and so I think that has certainly changed. I don't hear them talk about assimilation kind of this one-way adaptation process, but I think there's a lot of variation in whether city or state officials see it as their responsibility to set that integration process in motion. So is it immigrants themselves with the help of civil society organizations and family and friends, or to what extent can state or city government play a role in that? And there's huge variation in there. So I've done lots of interviews, for example, in Houston, where city officials, they see the need to help immigrants, get integrated, but they're not very certain what role city government should play in that process, and rather it should be left to civil society organizations and chambers of commerce and immigrants themselves. So I think that's another kind of discussion, like who should be kind of encouraging that process, and who should maybe foot the bill for it if there's costs associated with it. So, but it is more and more seen as a two-way process.
I want to thank you very much. And one conclusion in your book is that more systematic research has to be done, and because of understanding the processes of change. So I hope more books of this kind will come up, and we'll have more conversations like this, and with more positive views to the future. Thank you so much. Warm applause for Nancy Foner, Else Schouw. Thank you. So I want to thank you all so much for being here and creating this evening all together. Please be invited here to have a drink all together. And for the last question somewhere there, maybe you can ask them directly, and we can discuss things further here in where we have drinks and get to know each other a little bit better. Thank you all. Thank you here at the OBA, and I wish you all a very good evening. Bye-bye.